Hello, my name is Mattia Cellotto. I was supposed to do a presentation I developed this year, but due to health reasons, I could not take part at the time. So here I am capturing a presentation of what I had prepared for that day. The name of the presentation is From Cut to Boom, and it's about general learnings from creating an explosion sound library. This was developed while working on a library named Cataclysm, which is a collection of sounds that I published last year. It took about 3 years to be made. And we're going to be focusing on 3 recording sessions that I did for this library. So specifically, we're going to be talking about the pre-production recording and high-level kind of thoughts around creating an explosion-themed sound collection. So for the pre-production side, we're gonna be talking about finding the right kind of drive, the right motivation, contacting location managers, preparing for the sessions. For the recording and design section, we're gonna be talking about capturing and editing the content and a bit of a design walkthrough. So just what has been done to create the sounds, what kind of choices have been done, what kind of editing has been applied to the recordings to achieve the final results. And when it comes to high level, we're just going to be looking back at how everything was sort of put together from the beginning, do a bit of a post-mortem, and then I'll share some thoughts on retaining perspective, work-life balance, and remaining inspired. So, for the pre-production phase. First off, you're thinking about creating a library of any sorts, but in my case, this kind of explosion-themed library. The first thing that comes to mind, at least for me, is there's already so much out there. Is it really necessary to go out and create a new library? Can you do something that hasn't already been done? And does the world need more explosions? And if you could go out and get something, would it be able to compete with what is already out there? And, the bar is immediately set really high. And I think although this is part of the thought process that went through my head at the time, it's really kind of unfair to ourselves to start with any sort of endeavor with this specific thought in mind, if it's the only thought we have. So important to immediately take a step back, because other people's work can be inspiring, but it can also be equally intimidating. And trying to avoid what already exists, when you really think about it, if you look into it enough, everything is derivative to an extent. So it's a bit of an impossible constraint to do something that has never ever been done before to any extent. Plus, each one of us has unique sensibilities, abilities to, edit or mix, or just we make different choices. And that's also based, of course, on personal taste. For me, what has ultimately worked in the past is to follow my instincts and start without set expectations. So I'll just get my feet wet on a given topic and fail in a safe environment, and then just kind of go from there. So the same goes with the library. I didn't really start it thinking that it needed to be explosions only, and it didn't end up being only explosions. At the same time, I wanted to start from something that felt powerful, and I'll get into it a little bit more later, but as you'll see, the theme for the library has been developed while working on it, so there wasn't a fully kind of developed theme before starting, because that would already be too narrow of a theme or a direction for me. So when it comes to trying to find a safe space where to fail as much as possible, at the moment I'm located pretty much on the border to Denmark at Malmö in Sweden. And on the other side of the bridge in Denmark, there is this Middle Ages Center. So I was able to organize a bit of a recording session there to start to get an understanding of how it works when it comes to recording high SPL type of sounds. I just wanted to do it to kind of get into the idea of recording something of this type. I wanted to test on my microphones and understand how each one would be best positioned. Of course, there is a lot of documentation on this type of thing, but I just wanted to try it myself. And I wanted to experiment a little bit with some mic placements and weird mic choices and so on and so forth. So when I came back home from that recording session, I think I realized that although it was kind of nice to get some sounds and test myself on this new topic, the flatness of the Danish landmark really kind of it's sort of like very clearly translated into the recordings, because what I had in mind when I started this endeavor, and perhaps I should have been more honest about my about my intentions with myself when I did, was something like this. So this video comes from a collection of mine that I had saved on my YouTube channel for a long time, and I really enjoy this type of explosion because, of course, this is a mountain range, and when the sound goes off, it really does remain alive for the longest time. That's kind of what I wanted to get. Maybe not necessarily as washy in the sense that I wanted more distinct echoes, but something along those lines. And of course, that type of landmark was never going to offer it to me. And at the same time, thinking back to this initial recording session, I also realized, or at least went back to a library from Frank Breed named Gun Tales, where he recorded a few weapons in a landmark that had much more pinging in this distinct reflections. And this, of course, is like much shorter type of sound, but it is very interesting and more distinct than the previous example where, the sound changes quite dramatically over time. So, I took what the original test was. I thought about these two examples, and at the same time, I was kind of thinking about what was affecting me at the time, because again, it wasn't just about explosions in themselves. I wanted to create something that just simply could represent power, consequence. So what you see in front of you is a lot of influences that kind of made me want to stir a certain way with regards to how to create the library. So this is all to say that, there are influences and inspirations that have definitely affected me going into this, and I use them to kind of channel the energy and give myself purpose and find some form of abstract goal to give myself. So when editing, I would think, could the sound be used in something like Dune if I removed, for example, the attack of an explosion and maybe slowed it down? Could it be a layer for a punch in God of War or things like those, And when it comes to Returnal, that maybe kind of affected more of the synthesized part of the library, but it definitely had that kind of impact. But yeah, I think you can get an idea of the gritty type of aesthetic, still kind of realistic, sort of hyper-realistic that I was going for. And so all of this to say that, before setting the recording sessions, I would try to look for these influences and give myself enough momentum to hopefully clear that quality bar that we were talking about, to go back to the original example of, what is already out there. So this is all part of what I was hoping would lead me to clearing that bar. So once a bit of failure has taken place through the first recording session, it's time to get back into it, but with a bit more purpose. So I decided that I wanted to create the most varied and intense environmental responses in a sound library. And in order to make it happen, I would have to investigate kind of what is possible in Europe with regards to law and environmental restrictions, researching environmental reflections and explosions recording as much as I could, and contacting some friends in the US, Robbie Elias and Carl Fraser, who really helped shape the sound of the library, since they had access to some amazing landscapes such as canyons. And they did a great job capturing both footage and sound in those locations. And ultimately highlighted in yellow is the part that we're going to go over in this presentation, which is for me to go back home to Italy and its Alps to make the most out of the environment that is there. So that means that I was about to try and get some locations for recording explosions or high SPL type of sounds. I would have to get in touch with location managers, and I would have to explain to them how how the day would kind of develop, so to speak. And you can imagine that takes a bit of practice. So my first round of emails looked pretty terrible because I didn't put much of an effort into crafting a message that one could say yes to, considering that their job would be to keep the location and all of its inhabitants safe, if that makes sense. So I would say, I'm not in the country, but eventually I'll be there. And this is for an explosion recording session. Very loud noises for a destruction-themed library. Oh, let's talk insurance, because maybe there's something we need to figure out. And it sounds complicated, dangerous, and it sounds a little bit dodgy because I'm not even in the country. So, of course, this led to a lot of really bad outcomes, or better, no outcome whatsoever. And so I had to kind of change my approach. So in the second batch of emails, I did a bit of a branding exercise, and this has now become, or better, the library itself has become a collection of environmental responses. So this is not so much about recording explosions as it is about capturing the reflections of an environment. And honestly, that's kind of the same to an extent, but the focus of the library was going to be a little bit more on the tails than the attack. So it's just to craft a message that really kind of is a little bit more pleasing to read for someone that does work in an environment kind of setting. When you think about it also, if you're recording 15 explosions, realistically the loudest part of the explosion is only going to be about 2 seconds long, depending on how it goes. So it could only be 30 seconds of noise in total, or at least the part that is really high SPL, And of course, I would mention I have a budget, and that the project name was The Mountains Echo, and that was also done to try and, steer away from something that in my head, I don't think at the time the library was already called Cataclysm, but if it was called that, it would have been quite hard to work that into the email message and still make everything feel safe and professional, if that makes sense, because the other person on the other side of the email could have certain preconceptions about the word itself or whatever else. And of course, I was hoping for a higher rate of success on this. And the image on the right, where Fry is holding on those papers, that's actual papers that I had to sign in order to be able to record at one specific location. So that was like about 20 pages of, pretty much attesting that that it would be safe, and that, if I call a pyrotechnics company, they would have insurance, and so on and so forth. So that still was not an incredible success, but it was a success to some degree. I sent more than 100 emails to try and secure a location, and 6 locations were secured, and Pyrotechnics can only access to. Now I'm not showing everything that I've secured here, just some examples. So out of everything that I managed to do, we're going to be focusing on these 3 locations, excluding some that were done in Sweden. Again, we're focusing on the Italian side. So that was done 6 months before the first recording session. So what to do then? Well, the first thing that I did was purchase a propane can and a gas tank. Luckily, I was already in touch with Robbie Elias at the time, and I knew that he and a few colleagues tried this kind of technique to trigger high SPL transients in certain locations, and I thought that could work for my purpose as well. This was also an excuse to buy some gear, and of course, what isn't? So I got some more recorders, portable recorders specifically, so handheld, and we're gonna get into why in a second. I did some microphone research, location research, and microphone placement research, of course. And these are again highlighted in yellow, so we're gonna go over these. One thing that I hope I'm not going to get too much, I don't know, too much grief for is stating that yes, the best microphone is the microphone you have with you, but we're talking, at least in this case, about expensive recording sessions. So there's always, the counterside of if you're spending that much money recording, of course, bring more than one. So that's all I'm trying to say with that. And it's probably obvious for something like an Explosions recording session. So in my case, not only I wanted to have many microphones, but the most important thing for me was to have many perspectives. One thing that I did find out while recording the Canons in Denmark was that it didn't matter how long an XLR was, if they all led to the same XPRE, it was going to be very, very hard for me to have hundreds and hundreds of meters of cables leading to the MixPres and have that sense of, wow, that does feel incredibly different from the other microphone connected to this same recorder. And bear in mind, for all of these, in some cases, I had to take a cable car to go to recording sessions because, again, we're talking about mostly being up in the mountains, at the very top of a mountain. So XLR cables are pretty heavy, so that was not going to be a solution. So if we start from the bottom, perhaps, the MixPre 10.2s, I had two sets, and one would be quite close to the Explosion, and the other one would be at a medium distance of maybe like 100 meters, 150 meters. But when it came to really getting that different perspective from each microphones, I used handhelds. So the two Sony D100s, for example, would stay at least 200 meters away from the Explosion. But the most important thing is that they would be at a vertical distance from the Explosion that was quite drastic, meaning that, again, we're talking about mountains. So what causes the most dramatic changing sound, from what I could tell, was being below or above the Explosion, especially below, because then you would sort of be, the recorder would probably be isolated from the direct initial reflections of the Explosion and the direct source. So you would get a lot more of the late reflections, and the sound would be a lot different, drastically different. So yeah, everything you see in here is pretty much in the interest of having those different perspectives and not having to worry about XLR cables too much and so on and so forth. Granted, this is an insane amount of recorders for one person to handle, so it was impossible to monitor in real time, and given the constraints of recording explosives in the mountains, it was also impossible to go back and listen through every recorder to every single take and every single microphone within 8-track recorder. So that just meant that the only purpose that my headphones had is they're gun range headphones, and so they would just protect my ears while recording. But that said, it took a lot of faith in the equipment that I have to just trust that everything would work. So when it comes to the mics attached to the MixPre 10.2s, I had my stereo set of 8040s. I love them because they are dynamically safe, if that makes sense. They're very hard to kind of get them to clip, and they have great high frequency definition, and just in general, the transient definition itself is awesome. The 8050 is kind of like a similar deal, I guess. It just gives me a crisp center, and these are the ones that I would put kind of closer to the Explosion. The Sankensil 100 is, of course, not super great at high SPLs, but at the same time, as soon as it recovers from the initial slam, it can capture something that the other two mics that I previously mentioned might not reach. The Micro Uzis are actually perhaps even closer than the 8040s or 8050s because they are expendable to me, meaning they cost a little bit less. They could give something very interesting if they are absolutely kind of at the maximum threshold that they can take, so that half of the sound is kind of clipping at analog level and the other half is intact, which is an interesting kind of sweet spot for recording explosions in my experience, where you kind of get the aggression, but you still retain the usability. The KMR81i I find as the grounding microphone. It has pleasant mids, subtle highs, and sort of controlled lows. So when I go back home, I listen to it to remind myself how the explosion actually felt with my own ears, if I was so brave to remove the headphones at like 200 meters distance maybe. The Avisoft CMPA is a microphone that I started using for recording animals on my animal hyperrealism collection, and I love it for, the fact that it has an even more extended high range than the Sanken, but at the same time it's pointless below 2 kilohertz. It just captures some form of a clicking kind of sound, so it truly is just sort of like a layer mic, and I'll get into that a little bit later when talking about designing and editing. The DPA 4061 is I keep saying that something was the microphone as close to the explosions as it gets, but this one truly was, because it has a max SPL of 144 decibels, so you can really place it pretty much, not quite on the the explosion itself, but very close, and it will survive. The only problem there can be the cable, since it's quite thin, but yeah, for as long as you're careful about that, you'll be fine. And the geophone, which, kind of goes as low as it gets in terms of a frequency response. And then a couple of vintage mics, etc., just to kind of try things out. And last but not least, I tried this super wide ORTF experiment with the 8070s because, as I mentioned, the 8040s are my favorite mics, generally speaking. But while talking with Robbie Elias, he mentioned that he used to try and employ these 8070s looking away from the explosion towards, points of interest when it comes to late reflections. So I thought doing so, but in a stereo fashion that was kind of super wide ORTF, could be interesting. And this is not quite the angle you'd expect from ORTF, but it's because I'm pointing these two mics at two valleys that I noticed being very reflective in the later part of the sound. Okay, so why so many microphones? Well, it's because of creative empowerment, in the sense that the more microphones you have, the more choices you can make that maybe you wouldn't be able to make without them. You can get more bang for your buck, quite literally, in the sense that if you are limited to 15 explosions for a recording session, then if you're using microphones that are so far away from one another that it feels like one explosion has been recorded by 7 microphones in such a way that it feels like 7 different explosions, then you've recorded 7 different explosions. So, that helps a lot also for budgeting purposes. To be able to compare mics, so a little bit for science and research and, understanding how mics work in the future. And for future proofing, in the sense that if, for example, you wanted to employ some vintage mics that you didn't use so much on a library on a new project, then you could go back and, only use the more lo-fi kind of mics and create something entirely new. And to have room to experiment, just to try things and, be a little bit more comfortable with with the equipment because you used it so much. So this is something that I think in any presentation about recording explosions or weapons is shared. Planning things on Google Maps is really helpful. In my case, it was very hard to pinpoint where I would need to go because although the view is kind of nice, it doesn't represent the verticality of the place. And at the time, there could be something like, how would you say, a snow cannon or items that you didn't foresee being there because it's simply impossible to get a full picture before going to the place. So, of course, if you can, scout the place first and talk with the owners and, understand the full picture. But in my case, since it was not possible to do all of this before traveling to Italy, I had to kind of get a good idea from the top down, but then I had to go with the flow very much. And the usual last checks. So, charge all the batteries twice, bring all the gear, plus backups. In my case, I really don't trust high-rose connectors. They're flimsy and they've let me down in the past, so I bring backups. Bring hearing protection, of course, for yourself and maybe others. If if maybe the pyrotechnics company don't care so much, I think normally they bring them, but there might be some spectator that is not aware they need to kind of protect themselves. Do a sample rate and bit depth check, just because sometimes the recorders might reset without a battery. Ensure that SD cards are empty. Do a weather forecast final check just to make sure, because in my case I had plan A and plan B dates for every single session that I ran, and for every single session except one I had to resort to the plan B date. So send reminders as well to everybody involved multiple times and get written confirmation. And I say this because one of my pyros, for example, wrote me a message a week before a date that we were supposed to record, and he said, okay, I'll see you there tomorrow. And despite the fact that we had written confirmation over and over, everything was about to go south because this person was about to go into a 4 hours car trip to present themselves to the location a week earlier. And be there early. So not a week early, but in that case, if you are the one placing the mics, etc., try to be there at a time where you can do everything you need to do, place all the mics, place all the recorders, etc., with time to spare, without keeping anyone kind of waiting if you can. Then of course in most cases you all need to travel at the same time, so it might be tricky. Okay, so we're moving on to the second section, which is about recording and designing. Let's talk about the first recording session, which was in the Carrara Marble Caves, which is an iconic landmark in Italy since it has all this white marble and it looks incredibly stunning. One rule before every single explosion is I just ask everybody to be as quiet as possible afterwards. Again, this gets said over and over in any talk about this type of content, but it's really worth noting because sometimes even professionals like pyrotechnics will let themselves go and scream 2 seconds or 3 seconds after the explosion, thinking you don't care so much about the echo. So here we go. Let's take a look at how I got to the location and let's listen to some phone captures of what that sounded like. Okay, so you get an idea, and now we can take a look at a video where we can listen to every single microphone compare for the same explosion. Okay, so hopefully you can tell that the most dramatic difference is there where in the handheld recorders more so than mics that were connected to a multi-track recorder. Now, we get home and we have all of these recordings. So how do we clean them up? Well, okay, so I've divided the work that I've done on these recordings in 3 days. And this was also because at the time I was becoming a dad. So I had to limit the time that I could spend working on the library, and I had to make the most of it. So again, highlighted in yellow is what we're gonna go over in more detail. And the other things are things that I did, which I didn't think would be too relevant to this presentation. So in day one, I would crop all the takes so that the transients would be kind of aligned. And then I would realign the transients, in posts. And, if something was far enough that due to speed of sound and distance, it took a while for the explosion to get there, I would just kind of like align everything. Then I would boost the tails and consolidate the mic takes. And I would boost the tails because I already knew that my goal was to make really big and hyper-realistic tails. So I was okay with the idea of baking this type of a gain change in the tails. I would denoise and ultrasonic denoise the sound to take care of, for example, self-noise taking over time from mics such as the 8040s or the Sanken CO100. Low-end cleanup, so just kind of, making sure that if something went really deep, it didn't eat up all of the dynamic range of the sound at that given time. Debirding, declicking, debarking, pretty much removing anything that really doesn't need to be there. And at this point, on day one, I would use one monitoring solution, which would be just one pair of open back headphones. And I would try to do everything in about 1 to 2 hours to clean up all the microphones for one take though. So this is just one single take. And this is how it looked like, more or less. This would be the starting point, and you can see here that I've applied the gain boost in the tail, and you can see that because the self-noise of the mic is just kind of taking over after a while. So I would do a normal kind of a denoise, although you can see here that for me, explosion linear, the preset you can see on the right side, it was already kind of acting on the ultrasonic part of the spectrum a little bit more. Then I would do an ultrasonic only pass of denoising. So that would kind of take care of the self-noise of the mics. Then I would try to declick in problematic areas. And where that is not possible, like in this case, sometimes I would use ambience match to try and first train the algorithm on this specific part of the spectrum and then apply that kind of print onto a specific area. So in this case here, you can see I'm trying to remove a small click this way, and this would be more or less the final result. And I would need to now repeat it about 20 times. And I say repeat it 20 times, I mean the declicking sometimes would be done in batch by just kind of merging the view in RX, but most things needed to be done separately because the mics captured things at different times, or they just captured them in dramatically different ways. And now we are in my case, Reaper, and we're looking at everything summing up together. And of course, it's just too many cooks when it comes to trying getting a cohesive sense of, explosion. And especially when we think about, a designed explosion that needs to feel a certain way, etc. The last thing we want is to just play and let everything go out to the speakers the same way. So here's a bit of an insight as to how I edited everything to give it more of a sense of, how to design the sound. So in the DAW on day one, I will do kind of, I try to find the center of the sound, meaning the core of the sound, and I will try to enhance it. So this is about kind of figuring out, for example, okay, at the very onset of the sound, which mic captured best the initial transient, and 0.2, 0.4, 0.6 seconds later, is this still the best microphone for the job? Can I transition to another one? And so all of this would become a bit of an editing job with envelopes, that would kind of come and go to try and shape a sound around a center. A lot of subtractive EQing, because sometimes mics would just kind of capture slightly unpleasant frequencies over time that would sort of feel too static. And I would try to supplement with enforcer where possible, where maybe the low end was not feeling quite as tight as it could have, especially using something like the geophone. And again, all of this would be done with one monitoring solution. And I would try to employ pretty much 2 to 4 hours to find the aesthetic for the specific explosion. So the direction that I wanted to take to kind of deliver the final result. So here is an example of how this was done for one set of explosions. All right, so on day 2, I would extend this cleanup approach to all the other takes so that I would have all of my explos. I would try and see if an intentional transient displacement would work. So, did all the transients actually need to be aligned? Or maybe if one mic came in a little bit earlier, it could give you a sense of kaboom that felt a little bit bigger. And then I would duplicate the first edit. So on the right side of the slide, you can see what I mean. I used something called item take paste attributes in Reaper, which is great for kind of copying things like envelopes or fade shapes and lengths in between items. And if all of your takes started with the transient in the same kind of offset from the beginning, meaning maybe for every single take I would have 0.5 seconds of silence and then the explosion, like you can see in the first image on the top left, then I could pretty much copy paste every single one of my edits, not the sounds, but the edits to other sounds, saving myself a lot of time. Once that was done, of course, I would fine tune the transients. I would look for lacking elements because not every single take did feel the same when recorded. So some EQs that were valid for one take were not valid for another. And then I would just kind of drop a named region in the session just to kind of sort of commit to the final result without really committing to the final result. And at this point, I was using 2 monitoring solutions. So I would introduce a closed pair of headphones to be a little bit more analytical, and then a semi-open from, again, the first kind of day on the job. I'm still using that just to give my ears a bit of relief. And again, I would try to spend 2 to 4 hours to do this. And at the end of this, I would have a set of explosions. On day 3, all that I would do would be pretty much to add the regions and rename them, of course, for exporting purposes, export everything, and the final check in RX. So really, day 3 ideally is less than an hour, but at most 1 hour to really fine tune everything and make sure that, the sound is as round as it can possibly be. And at this point, I'm using a speaker set as well. Okay, now we can listen to some of the final results coming from the session that we just looked at. All right. Now we can jump on to the second recording session, where I had both a pyrotechnic company on the spot and a propane cannon. Again, we can look at how I got there and what it felt like to be there that morning. Again, audio from the phone at the beginning. So today we are in Italy and we're recording fireworks as well as a propane cannon. And I'm afraid of heights, so it's not nice looking down there. We're here today with one set of mics connected to a mixed preamp 2 line audio CM4s Ucho 8070s, said to be wide ORTF kind of thing. It's not really ORTF because the vast majority of the early reflections come from this direction and the later reflections come from that area. You can't really call them early reflections, I guess, but found a pyro. They managed to get permits to record here, so we have fireworks. Of course, these are more like reports. They're not really standard fireworks with visual effects. But also, finally getting to test my cannon. And here we have 8050 left and right wide ORTF, CMPA left and right wide ORTF, sort of slightly less wide, 8050 at the center, sunken CO 100. And that's it, all going into another mixed preamp in a beautiful day. So what I really liked about this recording session is that the pinging reflections that I had in my references were finally there. This is what I was after for the longest time recording this library. And this was the first that I managed to get exactly what I was after. Again, let's look at how the sounds from this recording sessions all came together in a designed form, if that makes sense, for one of the sets. All right, so yeah, at the end you could hear there are some new examples from different kind of sets. The third recording session was one of those for which I could not get any pyrotechnics company on site. due to it featuring a dam and it being a risk. So it was called Morasco Lake, and here I only brought my propane cannon, and I placed it in 2 different spots, only 2, and recorded a number of kind of transients there. So again, here's how it felt to be at the location and just kind of listen to the reflections for the part that is close to the dam, because it's quite interesting. Today we're recording at the Morasco Dam. There's a lake, artificial lake, just in between these 2 valleys. We have to carry a lot of equipment up there.
2 hours later.
All right, so in this case, we're just gonna jump straight to the final results because you might get an idea of how the editing process works. So here they are. Okay, so in terms of plugin use and editing choices made, there are a few things that I learned that I wanted to share that may or may not apply to, you know, your own way of working with this type of sound. For me, when it comes to low end, for example, trying to use the geophone was very hard because the sound captured by the geophone will just depend on the ground that it's planted in. Or, you know, if you have it again on a cannon or something like that, it will just kind of resonate to the, you know, the frequency of that specific solid object. But that would mean that very likely you're going to have a lot of energy that is kind of like sitting still and flatlining and then just kind of dying over time. What I like the most, generally speaking, when it comes to low end, is short and sweet, kind of like nice thumps of low end, and Enforcer gives me that. So most of the time I would use Enforcer rather than the geophone to get that sense of nice, quick, and deep dive. When it comes to high-end presence, if I am in need to remove, I found mVocoder to be quite useful, especially in the design phase of the library. It can really help kind of make something feel a little bit more ethereal and less grounded. C4 can be quite helpful just to kind of bring things to a more kind of leveled ground. And Pro Q3, of course, for like subtracting, EQing, and whatnot. If I do need to add high-end presence, then normally a Zenaptic filter can be very good, but again, mostly reserved to the design section of the library. Transx Multi is potentially my favorite plugin for doing this kind of thing, and I used it all over for the raw section, the design section, and I do that for pretty much any library that I make, no matter what the content is. I really love the way that it works and the control that you're given. Mag Audio EQ4, I like that too, mostly for the kind of air gain feature, which when that didn't suffice, I would use the Avisoft CMPA as a layer and just kind of control the high end in the sound. That's what I love about using this microphone. Is pretty much like having an enhancer already built in your session, and you can decide how much to bring it in or not. And you can even technically high pass the audible domain of the microphone and just kind of rely on it for when you pitch things down, and you can then export and resample in a Rex to understand how that sounds like. When it comes to faking pinging reflections, I found this specific couple of plugins in a chain to be working very well. You can pretty much solo the transients in a transgressor, and then you can put Enforcer next in line. And if you have a very quick spam control in Enforcer, so to speak, then you can kind of get this sort of crackling sound that both features the original transients of the sound as well as an added sweetener by Enforcer. Something that I learned is the idea of not revealing the effect. So you may have a very cool distortion unit or panning unit or whatnot, but if you leave them active for too long in the envelope of the sound, they will eventually reveal themselves, and maybe sound designers will even be able to point out, oh, you must have used this specific plugin, because I can tell after a while. So the idea is having all of these cool features high-fiving each other in time and coming and going and shining at the moment where they can truly shine, and then simply going away. And this requires quite a bit of editing, but I think it really helps to just kind of create even a cohesive sound that doesn't overstate itself in a specific characteristic, if that makes sense, but rather changes over time in an interesting way and in a way that is very hard to kind of grasp for the listener, even if they are experienced sound designers, hopefully. All right, we're now at the high-level learnings part of the presentation. So here, for example, we can talk about budgeting and organization. What I can tell you is, in my case, tossing money at a session did not guarantee any results. It may seem like it helped a lot to have access to these locations, and that spending money was the solution to getting them, but truly wasn't. In some cases, location managers were mostly interested in having the safety of the location preserved, but other than that, their goal was not to make money off of the location. So a lot of this was just kind of very much down to spending the time to find the right location, more so than tossing money at a problem in order to get good sounds. And also, with weather forecast and whatnot, it truly is impossible to have any guarantees. So you have to be at peace with the idea of failure. Casting the widest net you can also helps with being at peace with that, in the sense that, like I said, I had to throw about 100 emails just to get a couple of nice responses out of all of my efforts. So it really does help to try and go for a lot and then get back however little, but hopefully, statistically speaking, you're going to have a higher rate of success if you fail a lot. I don't know if that makes much sense, but yeah. And being at peace with a rejection, of course, is also very important, because it's just like I said, if you send 100 emails and you're gonna get about like 90 at the very least back saying no, or you're not gonna get replies at all, it may feel like you're pushing in the wrong direction, you're doing something wrong, and maybe you are, but at the same time, I think it's important to have faith that you'll eventually succeed. So yeah, to get to the last point, it's important to doubt ourselves and improve our methods, but also have faith in, a future success. When it comes to retaining perspective and ears, one thing that I think I used to tell myself a lot before working on this library, but even more working on this specific collection, is that every time I press spacebar, I need to do it for a valid reason. I used to listen to sounds back to back when I would start to work in the industry. And I feel like with every spacebar, I would convince myself to like the sound that I was working on a little bit more and lose perspective and start to appreciate its defects, perhaps. So these days, if I'm working, I really try to give purpose to my spacebar. If I'm looking at, a very specific artifact in RX and I fix it, if I can see already with my eyes, and having worked with isotope of RX for 10 years, sometimes I do see that I solved the problem, then I won't even listen to the thing, and I'll just kind of solve all of the other problems that I can see before I press spacebar and kind of take some good listen to the sound. And that's just both in the interest of not losing perspective from a creative standpoint and not fatiguing my ears. Because listening to the same exact sound, pushing on the same exact frequencies, it really does get tiring. Work fast, smart, and hard, but not long. That was kind of like maybe mandated from myself becoming a parent, but I think it does really help to kind of dive in, get the job done with confidence, and then just kind of move away. And then the next day, with new perspective, you can still look back to what you did the previous day and say, oh, whoever did this did it wrong, and then you can go at it again, of course. But I think it's important to kind of like not stay too long in the same process, because it will just help you keep a nice perspective. And the same goes for giving yourself different jobs. When I come back from a recording session, all I care about is cleaning everything up. I don't care about, designing the final sound or even designing the design version of that sound. I only care about, cleaning up the dog barks, the birds and whatnot. And then as I go on, I will give myself different jobs. Of course, if I find that I don't need to edit a specific microphone for any of the takes because the recorder clipped and whatnot, then I will ask my editor, aka myself, to not do that job. But you know what I mean. It's just important to kind of think of yourself as different roles in different points in the project, and especially when it comes to kind of mixing the sound together after the editing phase, it really does help, because you'll be less likely to keep a sound there just because you edited it. And it's very important in the later phases of the design to work subtractively and just be able to say, I don't need this. And then lastly, of course, automate anything that can be automated. I used my Stream Deck a lot on this project. And you may have seen at the beginning when I was showing my RX processes, I have a button for pretty much everything that I do there. So the process doesn't take as long as it could. In terms of work-life balance, for me it's very important to follow the fun. And I have said this before already in this presentation, but start things first and then doubting them along the way, meaning not getting too stuck into the ifs and buts of doing something, but rather starting to do it and then figuring out how to improve as I'm already in the process of doing the thing. Being patient with yourself is very important. In my case, it was important for realizing that this library would not come out as early as I wish it did. But, there are many aspects for which it's important to be patient with yourself, because this type of endeavor features a lot of failure, a lot of learning. And that's, what I love about it to an extent. But of course, it does take time, and patience really is key. Creating a workflow that works for you is very important. In my case, I wanted to save some time, but there are some kind of clicks that I kept there for myself because I find therapeutic. So, you can automate everything you want, but perhaps there are some features of your work that you really enjoy doing, and you may as well just keep them there. That sometimes you look at like captures on YouTube of people that have managed to automate so much. And in my case, at times I dread that kind of thing, because there is a certain sense of satisfaction in manual labor to me. But, there's definitely a sweet spot there, because I do automate a lot of what I do. So it's very much down to the individual, I think. Keep it sane. So, reflect on your priorities. Like I said, when I was working on this while becoming a dad, and at the beginning I thought, oh yeah, I can work on the library from 9 p.m. all the way until like maybe 11 p.m., wake up in the morning at 6, work until everybody else wakes up, have breakfast, go to work, come back, because this is a part-time endeavor to me and I have a full-time job. And, that lasted like 2 weeks at most, and then I was losing my mind. So, of course, reflect on your priorities when it comes to this thing, and, realize your limits and, where your energy is best spent. And when it comes to growth and learning, I think it's important for us to give ourselves real purpose, meaning I don't think this library would have been as good if I didn't stop and think, but what do I actually want to achieve? Explosions, yes, but what about them? Do I want to focus on the transient? Do I want, what do I want out of this? And, with so much content being created every day, it's very important to ask ourselves these type of questions, especially if you work in a game studio. Production may ask you these questions themselves, and having an answer will reassure everyone that the work that you're doing has purpose. Remain curious, so don't worry too much about budgets. Hopefully this talk doesn't take too much away from the lower endeavors in terms of things that are more easily achieved. There's a lot here to be shared because I think I spent so much time working on this specific library, but I could talk as much about recording a vase in my patio for the same library and then over designing it to be incredibly hyper realistic. Anything you do can be kind of purposeful, and a budget does help getting certain chances, but it's not everything. And things can be done in very different scales. So not everything that I did for this library involved huge budgets. Some of the recording sessions really did not cost that much. When it comes to maybe your product feeling derivative and whatnot, we already talked about it, but almost everything has already been done, but has it been done by you yet? Because as we discussed, there's unique sensibilities, there are so many things affecting the way that you work, even, the time at which you develop a project. If I was to start the same project today, I would have different influences probably, and I would end up with different kind of sounds. So it's always worth kind of going for something that inspires you. If you think you can kind of put your own footprint and kind of, create your own version of that thing. And when it comes to, looking at other people's work or even AI, I think it is important to channel that kind of impulse into inspiration rather than intimidation. So when you see everyone else kind of, capturing great sounds, designing amazing content, etc., be inspired if you can. Sometimes it is a little bit hard because, it is easy to be intimidated. But if you look into, having purpose, then I think it's very important to kind of learn from others and then repurpose the learnings for your specific use cases. So yes, this is what I learned working on Cataclysm, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Here's where I would normally do the Q&A if I was in person at Develop, but I'm not. So if you're watching this capture, please feel free to shoot me a message at mattiacellotto@gmail.com, or, reach out on Twitter, or just, feel free to check my profile on LinkedIn. Thanks again. Bye-bye.